Well, I'm looking forward to our discussion today, and welcome to everybody who's joining us. We're going to have a lively discussion on the new hybrid workplace, what you need to know today to plan for the return of your employees back to your offices, or maybe not. We've got four different perspectives that are going to be shared here today. Myself, I'm Carl Kutzmode. I'm the SVP of Consulting and Executive Search for TalentRise, and I'll be kind of contributing as it relates to recruitment and retention. We also have Alan Rogaway, who is with us from Cressa Global, and he's going to be sharing perspectives on the commercial office space tenant representative perspective. And Walker Lawrence, who's with us from living in Ginsburg, going to be sharing employment law or corporate law perspectives on the legal things you need to keep in mind. And then, of course, my co-host here, Trisha Daho, who's with her own company, Empowered, and she is a diversity and business strategy consultant, giving us kind of the insights around culture, diversity, and how your employees are going to be navigating all this as you make decisions. So with that, let me just do a little bit of a setup. I'm a junkie for news and information as it relates to our profession here. And I was reading a recent study that was done back in December by an organization called Predictive Index. And what I found in that study, it was a study of CEOs on, what are they doing in terms of the economic recovery and the plans to come back into the office, to bring your employees back to the office. And one of the key data points that really surprised me was 97% of the people surveyed stated that they were not planning to return to the traditional, mandated full-time 9-to-5 office workplace structure. And that's of CEOs. So if you think about it, these are the people that are making the decisions. And obviously they've learned a few things over the last year about a virtual workplace and what works and what doesn't. And they're starting to think about the future. A second study that I recently saw was written by Forbes, and they said over 60% of executives in corporations that were surveyed in their study don't have a plan for the future of work or location. So they're all everybody's sorting this out currently. So when you think about today's discussion, that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about, how do you manage remote teams? What are the decisions around things that you need to think about and considerations as you're planning, hybrid model versus fully remote? And then how do you preserve your culture as you think through these decisions? So with that, I'm going to start my first question. And I'm going to direct this one to Alan, and everybody can jump in after Alan responds. But, Alan, what do you think about the company's how the company's culture plays into this decision on an office space need when an organization is starting to think through and plan? Is it going to be hybrid, fully remote in certain roles, or go back to the traditional model? How does the culture play into that decision from an office space planning and decision?
Hey, Carl, thanks. And thanks for hosting, facilitating, and welcome everyone. I don't know, if it matters what I think. If you look at every news announcement on a corporate relocation, a regional headquarters, or any kind of relocation of size, for the past 5 years pre-COVID disruptions, the lead was that the move and the office design was based around enhancing culture, enhancing productivity and collaboration, retaining and attracting top talent, but culture and the physical manifestation of it in space was really the lead. I don't think that changed. I think those two things are tied together. I think when you talk about culture, I think that it's interesting because a lot of the announcements of the full remote or the full embrace or at least public statements about being remote are from more established companies that have their culture. I think if you're scaling, if you're trying to build, if you're in that creation of culture mode, to me, I think that people are going to be wanting to and needing to come together in a physical location. Of course, we'll get more into it, but we're all now much more aware of of the ability and, to still be productive working remote. So that'll be part of companies' cultures in order to, again, retrain and attract. But I think that space is tied directly to it.
I think that's a really good point. And, Trish, I know you and I have had some conversations around from the employer's perspective around how they're thinking about this from a cost, pushing some jobs out to 100% remote just to save money on office space. And how does that impact culture, and what do they need to do differently as they're thinking through this?
Yeah, I've also seen a lot of back and forth, very, very vibrant back and forth on LinkedIn on this very issue. Because there's two things happening. There's employers saying, but it's so much easier for us to lead if you all show up at the office every day. And we go back to some semblance of the way things were pre-COVID. And then there's employees who, in one of the recent surveys from PwC I read, 70 to 80% of them do not want to return full-time in the office. Here's the thing, it's very complicated. I don't think as a culture, you can sustain a culture completely by remote. It's extremely hard. The skill sets are not there for management or for employees to do that effectively. There needs to be some vibrant physical space to have those kinds of meetings that are important. On the other hand, having more of a hybrid workforce does give you an enormous opportunities that you didn't have before. I mean, big, huge corporations, I grew up in one, had hoteling 20 years ago. Now the middle market has woken up a massive amount in the last year and a few months and said, wow, we really can be pretty productive without having everyone here all the time. And you have the opportunity to hire, like Carl does, roles from all over the place to effectively integrate into your culture if you already have a strong culture to begin with. But to Alan's point, if you don't have that, if you are growing massively, it is important to have some kind of physical space in order to be able to not just communicate what your culture is, but exemplify it in practice every day. There needs to be a feel to what you're doing. And that's very hard to do remotely. We haven't exacted that yet, and I don't recommend it completely.
I'm going to piggyback on that real quickly. Thinking it from a legal perspective, one of the biggest challenges business owners are having with their employees is, managing discipline, managing performance, and also, onboarding, bringing on new people. And it's just not working remote wise. We don't have the tools in place for us to achieve the appropriate discipline and performance-based reviews and going through the process of how do I improve Jane Doe's performance? And then next step that when I get involved is how do we deal with that from a termination perspective? And when we're working in this remote environment outside of a physical office, that becomes really challenging to solve that problem. And so the remote work is great for lots of reasons, but it does present other problems. And then obviously, when it comes to employee engagement and from the perspective that I'm working with my clients in HR, that physical interaction just cannot be replicated in a hybrid situation. And so there's going to always be a place for space and for companies to have a central hub and location. It may not mean you're going to have 100% of your people there every day, but you're going to have 50, 60%. Because that's the kind of engagement that you need to really excel your team and ensure there's growth and opportunity for your business.
And I think, piggybacking on that, to use your words, Walker, one of the things that I'm hearing as a common theme from all three of you is the need to arm your leaders with new skills, because if you do have a hybrid workplace or you are pushing certain roles out 100% that weren't previously remote, and maybe they've just been viewing this as temporary, there's the command and control leader that's used to seeing everybody around outside their office and calling a meeting on the fly. And if you have a hybrid workforce where some people are remote and some are in the office again, you may forget that those remote people need to be included, and you got to set up a Zoom in order to be able, or Microsoft Teams to include them in those meetings. Plus, from a performance perspective, a lot of leaders will base their decisions around performance and assessment on performance on what they see, and it's hard to visibly see people if they're not interacting and engaging visually in some way. And those managers tend to want to call lots of meetings just to check in on people and in order to see them doing something, because they're fearful that if they're sitting at home, they're not doing things. So it's a whole different dynamic. So there's a lot of more training around how do you lead virtual teams? How do you manage performance in a virtual world? And then how do you engage those teams effectively and include them, be more inclusive, and just have that mental reminder that, hey, don't forget, we got people sitting at home still, we haven't brought them all back yet. So that's some of the things we're seeing. But Walker, go ahead.
On that really quickly, when you have a manager that's mentality is, if I don't see your butt in the chair, I don't think you're working. That can create a problem where you're treating a group of people better or differently. And that's where discrimination employment claims come into play. And there's usually reasons why someone's not coming to the office given the pandemic. And quite frankly, they tend to be protected class reasons. So we've got to rethink management's thought process of, if I don't see John over there in my chair, he's not working, because that can create an unintended discrimination claim. And we've got to make sure we manage that thought process going forward. And that goes to culture as well, because we need to be accepting of those people that aren't physically present in the office.
That's a good stepping off point to my next question. As companies are planning for, bringing people back into the office, and now with more and more people getting vaccinated, the decision is, do we mandate vaccinations to allow those people to come back, or do we do it just for certain roles? Or, there are some people who maybe still have kids in remote learning, or they have an elderly parent that's at high risk at home that they can't risk going to an office if they have somebody who isn't vaccinated. So there's a lot of decisions around just that whole concept as they're planning on that. So what are your thoughts, Walker, from a legal perspective around mandating, vaccination in order to come back?
It's a complicated question, and I literally receive calls on this daily. From the start, can an employer mandate vaccines with their employees? The answer is yes. But that answer comes with a whole host of questions and challenges that come behind it. And what I kind of look at it from my client's perspective is, what's the business justification for it? Why are we asking our employees to be vaccinated? Is there a business reason because our clients expect it, because we have customers coming into our store? Is there a business reason because my employees are traveling and I want to make sure that they're safe? Is it because they're going to conferences and they're going to be with a bunch of other people? And so, part of our general duty of safety and care to our employees, I want to make sure they're vaccinated. But, the question really needs to begin from, what's the business reason? And then from there, we can take the steps to figure it out. It may be, I just want to encourage my employees to get vaccinated. I'm not going to require it. There's some issues that have to be dealt with there. And then you also hear about businesses that are doing incentives for getting vaccinated. That comes with a whole host of other challenges, because you may give an incentive to someone that gets vaccinated, but what about Jane that can't get vaccinated because she has a medical condition? Now you're potentially discriminating against her. So we've got to be thoughtful about that. Thankfully, the EOC actually yesterday announced they're going to be coming out with some additional guidance on how businesses can do incentives and not violate Title VII and the ADA. And we'll look for that guidance to see what's going on. But the vaccine question is also a cultural question. It's what do you as a business feel your culture should be in terms of promoting vaccines? And you've got to just be thinking through all of those challenges.
That's a good pivot over to Trisha, our culture expert. Additional thoughts on the vaccine, or how to navigate that from Trisha's perspective?
Yeah, I think the vaccine, well, we're going to move through this, right? We're not going to be in a position where we have to worry about whether someone is vaccinated forever. At some point, this will be much more of a rote exercise. But I think what you need to do is, from a strategic perspective, is look at the big picture. Can my employees be extremely productive if they're not here, or they're only here some of the time? I think you'll say yes to in most situations to that question, and then take one more step back and say, from a business perspective, how is this going to work? From a cultural perspective, how is this going to work? It takes an enormously different and maybe amplified level of communication protocols for people to be participating in your culture every day as part of your organization. And that's the one thing that we still have yet to learn well. The equity and inclusion part of DEI is really very much at stake here. So to Walker's point, if you are excluding because they're not in the office, you're missing out on their productivity, obviously, but you're also missing out on what you intended to have them be as their role in the organization when you hired them. So having very frank and candid and open discussions with your employees on a regular basis about how that is working, having someone help mentor and coach the leadership and the employees as to how that kind of situation works well. I can tell you from my own perspective and the experiences I've had in a prior life that we gave the opportunity to do flexible work arrangements or flex place to our high performing employees. And it was more difficult if our employees were less communicative or not as productive for us to let them have more flexibility with regard to where they worked. So putting some parameters in place that obviously apply to everyone, considering your entire culture and how it's working, and making sure you have assessments of how it's working as you go, because you're not going to be able to see it yourself. You have to do assessments that have people tell you, or have someone that is not so in it with you tell you what's really happening is really important. And then changing it as you go, just like any other growth strategy.
Really good point. That linkage to, it used to be a privilege, for your
Right.
top performers, and now it's kind of expected. And, employees have gotten into the mindset. And I think that's going to be a challenge. And I'm seeing it already as employers are starting to recruit. If the first question, especially if someone has found that they're more productive or they're able to work their life in employee, employment with their life better by working remotely, it's an expectation. They want to know,
Right.
Can I work more flexibly? Can I come into the office a little later and leave a little earlier or whatever? So it's an expected opportunity that we're starting to see. Alan, I want to hear your perspective on this topic. I know we started out with vaccination and mandates and how do you do that, but maybe you've got a perspective that's a little different on all of this.
Yeah, I'll leave that to the Walker and Trishas on what you can mandate, and but again, we started with the idea that companies to attract and retain and great talent are going to have to offer different programs than what they used to. I think at the end of the day, Trisha just talked about it. I mean, productivity is going to drive this thing. There's going to be trial and errors. We're going to give people trust to be able to make certain decisions. But if performance, and again, Walker, you said it, you got to be very clear about expectations. And if people are hitting or exceeding those benchmarks and showing that they can have some hybrid, if not a full remote work experience, it's going to be embraced. If we find that competitors start to outperform that are more mandating back in the office, it's going to be a pretty quick switch to getting back down and growing within a company, promotions and these kind of things. I think we're gonna watch this play out. No one has definitive about it. I'd say that we are encouraging, once people have been vaccinated, are comfortable, and underlying health things notwithstanding, that we come together, because most of the work we do is client facing for advisors. It is about, getting out, going to lunches, coffees, social activities with clients. So those kind of things do happen in a central, easier if you're centrally together. So yeah, no, I don't think there's gonna be a lot mandating, but I think over time it's gonna be an encouragement to collaborate and be together.
One of the things that I've seen with my clients, and we've actually, our company itself, our HR department sent out a survey just before year end, asking the employees, how is this working for you? Would you, as we look to the future and figure out a return to work, would you prefer to have a hybrid? Would you prefer to be 100% remote? Would you prefer to be in the office? And it was a large part, I think it was over 60% wanted a hybrid. They just want flexibility. I mean, it all boiled down to people figured out that they could get their work done in a way that worked for them. And so I guess the mantra as companies start to look is, let's ask your employees as a starting point what they're comfortable with, because if you don't have that perspective, you're going to end up with turnover in the roles. Once you start mandating certain people come back that aren't ready to come back, you're going to end up with turnover. And then you have to call people like us to help you fill those roles. That can be expensive. But at the end of the day, the more you kind of listen and accommodate and offer flexibility, the more you're going to be able to retain your top performers and attract talent to your organization when you're making those decisions. Next point I want to pivot on to is growth. Trisha mentioned scaling for growth and how you can sustain your culture as you plan and grow your business. And so maybe we could do a little deeper dive into that. Trisha, you want to start that discussion off?
Yeah, I think, again, it's important to clearly understand where your culture currently sits. I can tell you from my own doing these assessments of culture for the last year and a half, 2 years, that most companies are kind of surprised when they do surveys or reviews of HR data to figure that out. Start with a kind of a pulse check-in for your employees and segment them by people hired in the last year versus long-term employees. So you can see what the COVID experience has shown you about what your culture says versus people who have been there long-term and know both sides of that. And then use it as an opportunity to refine your culture for the future and be intentional about what you want. So most companies, even really big ones, kind of create a culture by happenstance, and they're either really happy with the way it turned out or not as happy with the way it turned out. But everyone has a culture. They just don't normally know what exactly they did or were very intentional about it. But in this case, I would not risk that, because if you do, and you end up going downhill on your culture because you have turnover or lack of morale, you don't want to do that and then pay the prices for it. So creating actual goals and key performance indicators around what a great hybrid employee looks like, revisiting what you already have in the performance process and augmenting it significantly for how a hybrid employee functions well in our current culture or the culture we're intending, I think is really important as you scale, for sure.
Great points,
Trisha.
Yeah.
Hey, sorry, Carl. Trisha, I'm just curious. Is anybody that you've worked with who had, a rated poor culture, pre-2020, come back and said, well, it's really been enhanced over the past year? I mean, is it by communicating maybe even better because forced to? I mean, I'm just, that's,
yes,
it seems like if you had a good, go ahead.
If you have, I'm called into situations where it's a massive mess and we have to clean up the mess. And then I'm called into situations that are already good, but want to be really great. So I'm working with both sides of those. For the ones that were really bad and then went remote because of COVID, I can tell you that improved significantly because the stress of being in that office space was eliminated and people could take a breath and be away from it and all those things. So I think, yes, to your point, Alan, that's an indication you need to work on your culture. It's not an indication that you shouldn't have an office space, though. So fix the culture. The office space will be great because it helps you amplify that culture in a great way. But those two things do not automatically completely intersect the way that it sounds.
Got it.
So Alan, I want to kind of dive a little deeper on this concept of companies that are in scale mode with you, because I assume that, the planning and design phase of that decision process to open up new offices prior to COVID would have been pretty straightforward. We're going to hire so many people. We need offices in these markets. What are some of the considerations that employers in growth mode are thinking through or have to plan for as it relates to, bringing people back and opening up new spaces, and what are some of the options they're considering?
Yeah. So again, the first period of when the world changed, I think, was companies getting their feet under them, resetting, using these new tools, getting everyone acclimated, The last, part of the year into this year has been, really reimagining, stepping back, and thinking, how can we be, again, more productive, not as productive, not less productive, more productive in reimagining a hybrid workplace. And it's really getting into, and again, the work we do with companies, Carl, I do put my sector of the industry at a high standard, that we really do want clients who want to get into it, who really want to be thoughtful about their people and place. And this everything that's gone on has caused this to become much more intentional than I think, in the past, which everyone was just mirroring others in their industry from the same benching systems. If you looked at the offices, they were all pretty similar in density and configuration. Now companies are really thinking about individual roles and who they're hiring and what they do day to day and what they need to become, as productive as they can be. So I look at, this as being, it was forced upon everyone, but that is, if you can say, a good element of what's gone on. Everyone is really getting much more thoughtful about how they bring people in, how they onboard them, and then this workplace.
Thank God, right? That's great.
Yeah, great points. I would say, I'd imagine that they're, as you said, they're thinking through social distancing. So instead of being used, I think the trend was prior to COVID, they were starting to move people to these long tables where you were sitting right next to each other. And, on the other side of these tables in some offices, I know some of the corporate recruiting teams that I would meet with all of a sudden got rid of their private offices and the traditional cubes and these long tables. And it didn't work as well for recruiting teams because they're all on the phone and they're all outgoing and they're all people-minded. So it was very hard to focus. And I think they're all jumping for joy right now because it's starting to give them a little bit more space and the ability to work from home and what have you. So they've rethought that in their decisions. Walker, I'm curious to hear your perspective in terms of like watch-outs people have to think through as they look at physical space decisions, locations, et cetera.
Yeah, one of the key things that particularly professional service organizations, think accounting, think lawyers, think digital marketing, they are able to, branch out in a much larger region to find talent. So I know I have a client that's a CPA firm. They're now retaining talent in the middle of Idaho rather than buying here in Chicago. Why? Because it's cheaper. They can typically find a more capable accountant, and they can pass that savings down to their client. But there are some challenges that come with that type of scaling process, namely that as you expand your workforce into other states and municipalities, you are now subject to a whole host of additional new laws that you never were expected to follow before. And when you place, a human, an employee in a state, you're now subject to those laws. So I have a client right now, we're updating a handbook for California. Why? Because they hired a new sales guy that's based in California, and you can't even begin to imagine the complications that creates. So there is a caution that needs to be kind of thought through if you're going to hire people outside of your home region. There are new laws, new ordinances, particularly with people and employment, that you have to consider, because the drive right now is local ordinance, local municipalities, cities are the ones that are driving the progressive laws and expectations, not on the federal level. So that means you need to make sure you're compliant and thinking through all of those challenges as you cross state lines. And I'm not an accountant and I won't even get into this, but there's also tax considerations that you need to be thinking about, and all sorts of problems as you kind of expand from being in just Illinois to being in Idaho to being in California, that you got to work with your advisors to think through those challenges before you just decide, I'll hire anyone willy-nilly wherever they are, because there are some downsides to it as well that we've got to think through.
That's a really good point. And our company is part of a larger global entity, and one of our sister companies has seen a huge increase in it's a company called Akara Solutions, an employer of record concept, where companies that struggle with, they've all of a sudden had to hire people remotely in other markets that they weren't in, and all those complexities you talked about. So they were able to put up an employer record and payroll them because our sister company already does business in those states. and then contract them back. So that's an option for those employers that are struggling, with that decision
Yeah.
and kind of figure out and navigate it.
I see way more opportunity than I see challenges in this one, though. I really do.
I agree.
I think when so many of the industries I work for are looking to do talent acquisition strategies with us to get more diverse talent in the door, because I work with companies that are usually very male dominated, very white dominated, because that's why they're calling me. And I can tell you that it opens up an enormous opportunity for a lot of those companies if they do it effectively. And that's the big if, right? Some of this stuff is complex. The good news is there are providers that can help you do everything you're going to do. So there are lawyers that can help you with regard to all those different states. There are tax professionals that can handle many states at once. There's ways to get that done. And the technology is way better than it was 15 years ago on this stuff. So the good news is, yes, it is, while it is complex, it's also a giant opportunity for employers to not just, if you're living in, I don't know, let's say Helena, Montana, and you have a hard time just getting any talent at specific levels, this is a whole new opportunity. And you don't even have to move them to Helena, Montana, or prove to them that Helena, Montana is the best place on earth. You get to actually think maybe they can live in Chicago and work for us. So that, to me, it shows us that if we do it right, if we're intentional about it, it's a giant opportunity, I think, even for growing companies, scaling companies.
I'm
No, I
seeing it
agree.
every day.
Yeah, just because there's challenges doesn't mean it's not worth taking that step. You just got to make sure you're intentional and think through it, because I find a lot with my clients, good choices, good intentions sometimes lead to unintended consequences on the employment side. And we just got to
call
make sure
Walker early, not late.
I'm much cheaper if it's before than later.
We see it just in our recruiting effort. We've had clients that were of the mindset, and the talent pool was very small in their market prior to COVID, and the search would be open for a much longer period of time. And we paused several searches and they've all come back. And one of them, who was the diehard must relocate to Chicago in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of rioting downtown, we said, pause this search, that ain't gonna happen. Finally said, I'll let the candidate that we liked last year stay remote for the next 3 years if they need to. And now we're revisiting that. They're starting to, because they're okay, like, let's just look at where the talent lives now, which is good. I'm looking at,
Paul?
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I think you're doing the same thing. Just because of time, and I know Walker was going to have to leave us. Do we want to open it up a bit and just
That's exactly where I was going to go. I think we've had a great discussion here, and I think if there's anybody out there, just put some notes in the chat here. I've opened it up for chat questions, and we'll try and address them. I do have one from Diane Testa, who's really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, Diane. She wants to know if we have an example of a company who's been very successful with a hybrid model so far, one that maybe we're working with, and what's working for them, what works really well. I'm going to stop and pause.
I am dying to answer Diane's question. So thank you, Diane. The successful hybrid cultures, and I've thought about this as other people were talking and I was looking at your question, I think have like 3 or 4 primary attributes. They're a growth mindset culture, which means we assume people can change and that we are going to change as a company and morph into whatever our evolution is supposed to be. That's number 1. We honor and value self-reflective people. And we easily have conversations back and forth about feedback on how people are doing and how they're showing up and rising up to the occasion. And we are making sure that the people we hire are values-based, so they're matching and aligning with our values as a company in a way that means they have high EQs, emotional quotients. It's harder to read people and have effective interactions in a remote space like this one. And being able to get those skill sets, and then enormously good communication skills. Those are the traits that I would have in a company where the leadership is really doing it right, because they are exemplifying those skills, expecting it of their people, and getting their people up to speed on those kinds of skills. Communication skills become twice as important they're probably the most important thing in the first place. They're twice as important in this kind of environment. And my best employees are the ones that are obviously highly productive no matter where they are, take ownership of what they're supposed to do and initiative around what the next steps are, and are really good communicators both to clients and to the rest of the team as to where they are, where they sit, what they need help with. If you can effectuate those 4 or 5 attributes, you can do a hybrid workplace very effectively.
And I'm going to pivot on that, Trisha, because that brings into mind the organizations that have recognized that, have invested in training to try and bring the skills up so that people can do that. But they also have had to make some tough decisions if they've decided to go more virtual, that certain people just aren't going to be able to work virtual.
Right.
They maybe have a small apartment and they don't have a separate space, and they've got 3 kids and 2 dogs and a cat and a bird going on. And so they're not able to work in that, but their job was moved virtual. And so they may have to find a different way to accommodate that individual. So there's going to be some tough talent decisions.
There's also going to be some tough decisions after that fact of the employees as to whether leaders can really do this effectively.
Exactly.
And it might just not fit in because they can't lead and they can't kind of morph their leadership style to handle a hybrid workplace.
Exactly.
I want to emphasize what Trisha highlighted, which is communication, and that really plays a role in where I'm working with my clients. So successful hybrid workplaces are at the forefront of getting their policies, their decisions, and being transparent with their employees now, and evolving and being flexible as this world changes. So the successful companies that are implementing this are making, their leaders are making decisions thoughtfully, quickly, but thoughtfully, and then communicating it and inviting immediate feedback and using that feedback chain to improve, get better, and be on top of it as we deal with these changes of, temperature screening and, health screens, those sorts of things that we were doing, 9 months ago. Now we're talking about vaccine. The businesses that are being successful at it with their employees from a legal compliance are opening up the door for active communication. We're learning about those employees that maybe have some hesitancy about a vaccine or about returning to work. And, it's all about dialogue and engaging in those thoughtful discussions, because at the end of the day, there's usually a middle ground where everyone can be successful and your employee and the employer can be happy with the solution. It's just both of those parties need to come together and have that chat. Now, obviously there are some exceptions to that and we need to work through that, but it all begins with, active communication with our employees and being welcoming and showing them a commitment that when you get that feedback, you take it and you react to it and you respect that feedback that you're getting from your people.
Awesome. Great tips. And I've got one last question from Bob Martin. What advice would you give an employer whose office lease is renewing in the next year as they begin to sort through all these decisions? And maybe that one will go to Alan first.
Hey, Carl, can you repeat? I'm looking at the chat box. I was reading another question that just came in. Go ahead. This is from who? And can you read it again?
Yeah, I had it from a person, Bob Martin, but it's, what advice would you give a person on an office lease when they're renewing in the next year? And then we'll get to this last question here shortly.
Yeah. So again, I think it's starting with the business strategy, the stuff we've been talking about, really working through, and again, reimagining. But you have, again, this gets into then market to market, but pretty much across the country, the office sector is more tenant, corporate, occupier friendly, and we expect, because companies have been right sizing and putting a lot of space in the sublease market, you have more time and to really think through what you want to do. Landlords are becoming much more, they understand much more. They need to become partners with their tenant clients, and so they're more flexible. We had, an example of, I won't mention names, landlord agent saying something to the effect of like, we might consider, and that my client had no interest to deal with them. They want a landlord that of course is going to consider flexibility in term, optionality in term. So I think if you have a lease coming up, and you get the business strategy, the workplace strategy down, you have a great window of time over the next couple of years.
Awesome. And I know I've got one last question and then we'll wrap here from Michelle. Michelle's got she came from a smaller organization in terms of office staff, and now they've got discourse going on amongst those that physically are coming into the office versus those that are not. And she's like, how do I get them back into a cohesive team, happy work environment that includes both in-person and virtual employees? Is there any tips we have for getting them together so that there's not this discourse? Trisha, thoughts?
Yeah, I think, well, I'm going to say this without knowing anything about the culture you had before COVID, so keep that in mind. But I think the thing that comes to mind first is to not make it us versus them, like not to refer to them separately, to basically refer to everyone and know that everyone is expected to contribute in the same way, whether they're there or not. I think it's important for leaders to kind of help both sides of that equation, or all employees, understand what the role is of the people that are remote, how they contribute to what's going on in the company, and how they can do that effectively. It's about being very transparent about it. If there are issues with remote employees because they aren't as communicative, those should obviously be handled, as contemporaneously with the events as possible. It's kind of like morphing your leadership and your employees both into developing the skill sets to work seamlessly across, venues. And what I mean by venues is bringing teams together that are both physical and remote. So it's not anything different than it was before. Like being able to do that effectively is going to be very important. It's treating everyone like this is the way we do things and this is how we're effectuating it and this is how it's working successfully is extremely important. So it's kind of like making sure you have a level playing field for contribution because you're managing both at the same time in the same spaces.
And those are really great points. One of the things one of my clients shared with me that's been really helpful for them is that they have a regularly scheduled virtual happy hour every week on Thursdays at 4 o'clock, I think it was. And somebody on the team, both in the office or virtually, hosts it. And when they have the host seat, they have to come up with something that engages the entire team around a conversation. And so they can't talk politics, but it might be something about maybe they come from a certain cultural background. They share something unique about their culture, or one person came and is really big and into dogs. And so she talked about her dogs and everybody talked about their pets. And, it's just stuff to get a common bond to bring them together.
Right.
On a non-work related discussion for, I don't know if it was 30 minutes or an hour, but she said that has gone way beyond, people look forward to that every week. It's their break in their life. It's their break between the 40th Zoom call that they've had that week, and they look forward to it. So hopefully that tip helps.
I think we've always, as a culture, across our country at least, assumed that we've never put as much emphasis on the importance of the informal relationship building we do in the corporate spaces. Extremely important to how a culture goes and how ultimately people experience your culture as they rise through the ranks. And being able to effectuate that in a hybrid is extremely important to further success.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both. And I know Walker had to jump off for a client meeting, but what a great discussion today. Really appreciate all your contributions, and for the people who gave us some questions and for everybody who attended, thank you for supporting us. And we will post a recording of this out there once we get it kind of cleaned up a little bit. You can reach us via the posts on LinkedIn. Obviously, we were connected through LinkedIn. And then if you have any interest or questions, certainly reach out to us directly that way, and we'll go from there. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
And good luck.
Thanks,
Thank
Carl.
you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Take care.
Michael.